The Treasury Department's briefing room was tense as Secretary Scott Bessent announced a seismic shift in U.S. trade policy. The U.S. had sent ultimatum letters to over 100 nations, renegotiate all trade agreements under an America First framework, or face sweeping tariffs. This was not a negotiation but a demand. Washington dictating terms with unprecedented force. The administration claims this move will correct decades of unfair trade practices that have hollowed out American industry. Countries were given mere weeks to comply, with terms heavily favoring the U.S. and offering little in return. This marks the most aggressive use of economic leverage by the U.S. since the Cold War, tearing up the World Trade Organization's rulebook. The era of free trade is over. Multilateral consensus is replaced by unilateral decree. The administration blames globalism for America's economic woes, especially China's rise, and seeks to dismantle the system itself. Bessent spoke of fairness, but the ultimatums feel like surrender terms for other nations. The scope is breathtaking, targeting both major partners and smaller economies reliant on U.S. markets. Tariffs, once targeted tools, are now weapons of mass economic disruption. The underlying belief: the world needs America more than America needs the world. But in a multipolar world, this assumption faces its toughest test yet. After Bessent's announcement, Washington expected frantic negotiations. Instead, it was met with silence. Over 100 nations simply did not respond, a quiet, coordinated act of defiance. The world has been preparing for this moment, choosing to look away from Washington. As the U.S. turned inward, other nations built new networks, shifting their focus to China and India. China's Belt and Road Initiative and India's economic rise have made them the primary partners for much of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These countries now see their future growth tied to Beijing and New Delhi, not a protectionist America. The ultimatum, meant to pull nations closer, is accelerating their pivot eastward. This is about more than economics, it's about dignity and sovereignty. Many leaders see the ultimatum as a colonial-era insult, and cannot be seen capitulating to U.S. pressure. By refusing to engage, they signal the world is no longer a collection of client states, it's a multipolar arena where nations have options. The silence is strategic, a bet that America will hurt itself more than them. The global order is shifting and the U.S. is no longer at its center. The White House escalated further, announcing tariffs on countries deemed anti-American. These penalties aren't tied to trade imbalances but to perceived political disloyalty, a dangerously vague standard. What counts as anti-American? Voting against the U.S. at the UN? Buying from rivals? The lack of clarity breeds fear and uncertainty. Trade policy is now a tool for enforcing political conformity, not just economics. Allies are as vulnerable as adversaries. Even Germany could be penalized for its energy ties or trade surplus. This threatens the very concept of alliances, which have always allowed for differences. The new approach demands absolute alignment with U.S. directives, putting partners in an impossible position. Many may decide such an alliance isn't worth the cost, weakening the network that underpins American power. The anti-American tariff is a high-risk gamble that could backfire. By punishing dissent, the U.S. risks losing friends and gaining determined rivals. Countries are incentivized to diversify away from the American orbit. Instead of compelling loyalty, this policy breeds resentment and resistance. The weapon could damage America's global standing more than its targets. Financial markets reacted swiftly and negatively to the tariff ultimatum. The S&P 500 suffered its sharpest drop of the year, as investors braced for global disruption. The market saw the ultimatum as economic self-sabotage, with nearly every sector hit hard. Tech giants and manufacturers reliant on global supply chains saw stocks plummet. Even domestic companies suffered as inflation fears grew. Tariffs are taxes on consumers, raising prices on everything from electronics to groceries. The bond market grew anxious. The U.S. runs massive deficits financed by foreign buyers of treasury bonds. If countries like China and Japan are punished, why would they keep buying U.S. debt? A slowdown in foreign demand could spike interest rates, raising borrowing costs for everyone. This risks triggering a debt crisis and severe recession. The market's violent reaction was a warning. America's leverage isn't as absolute as it once was. Investors doubt the administration's strategy, fearing a painful backlash at home. The world is less willing to bankroll U.S. policy missteps. The economic fallout could be swift and severe. While Washington wields tariffs, the BRICS bloc, now expanded, has quietly built an alternative economic system. Their strategy dismantle American financial dominance, not through confrontation, but by creating a rival system. BRICS nations have steadily increased trade in their own currencies, especially the yuan, bypassing the U.S. financial system. This non-dollar trade zone shields members from U.S. sanctions and pressure. Central banks in China and Russia have been stockpiling gold, reducing reliance on U.S. Treasury bonds. Gold is a hedge against instability and a signal of distrust in the dollar's long-term future. The expanded BRICS bloc now represents a larger share of the global economy than the G7. They control vast resources, population, and industrial capacity. The U.S. is no longer dictating terms to a world of dependence, but facing a powerful coalition. The tariff threat may only accelerate the construction of this alternative bloc. America's dominance is being challenged by a coordinated, resource-rich rival. The world is building a parallel universe, one less vulnerable to U.S. leverage. The dollar's supremacy is no longer assured. Washington's tariff ultimatum ignores a basic truth: economic weapons cut both ways. The belief that the U.S. can inflict pain without suffering is a dangerous miscalculation. New tariffs would immediately raise costs for American businesses and consumers. Companies reliant on imports would face higher expenses, passing costs to customers and fueling inflation. Everyday goods would become more expensive, hitting lower and middle-income families hardest. The policy, meant to protect jobs, could trigger a recession that destroys them. Punishing allies and rivals alike is pushing them closer together, strengthening their own trade blocs. The U.S. risks isolating itself from new, powerful networks forming in response. The greatest risk: the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. Weaponizing access to U.S. markets encourages the world to seek alternatives. The more the U.S. uses its power punitively, the more urgent the search for substitutes becomes. The tariff ultimatum is a global advertisement for de-dollarization. America's own actions could undermine the foundation of its power. This crisis is more than a trade dispute. It signals a fundamental shift in global power. The unipolar era of American dominance is over. The world is now multipolar. China's rise, India's resurgence, and the BRICS bloc are structural changes, not passing trends. Washington's tariff ultimatum is an attempt to restore lost dominance through coercion, not competition. In today's world, power comes from innovation and partnerships, not building walls. By threatening partners and rivals, the U.S. is choosing isolation over engagement. This cedes the future to others, letting China and its allies write new rules. The alternative is to compete more effectively, investing in education, infrastructure, and research. America's strength comes from dynamism and openness, not bullying. The world isn't waiting for the U.S. to adapt, it's already moving on. The Treasury's ultimatum letters reveal anxiety, not strength. Unless U.S. policy shifts from punishment to genuine competition, decline will accelerate. The choice: adapt and lead through excellence, or become isolated in a world that's moved on.